When people think about the Bible's grand narrative, they often focus on Israel, Egypt, and Babylon. However, what many don't realize is that modern day Iran, known as Persia in biblical times, was also a central player in God's divine plan. The history of Persia is deeply intertwined with the story of God's people, dating all the way back to the descendants of Noah. From the earliest generations after the Great Flood, the ancestors of the Iranian people were already shaping world history in ways that would ultimately fulfill biblical prophecy. To understand Iran's biblical roots, we must go back to the book of Genesis, where the origins of all nations are traced through Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. According to Genesis 10, Japheth's descendants spread across various regions, establishing some of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. One of Japheth's sons was Madai, whose lineage became the foundation of the Medes, one of the two great peoples that would later form the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes initially settled in what is now northwestern Iran, and over time they became a dominant power in the ancient Near East. When people think about the Bible's grand narrative, they often focus on Israel, Egypt, and Babylon. However, what many don't realize is that modern day Iran, known as Persia in biblical times, was also a central player in God's divine plan. The history of Persia is deeply intertwined with the story of God's people, dating all the way back to the descendants of Noah. From the earliest generations after the Great Flood, the ancestors of the Iranian people were already shaping world history in ways that would ultimately fulfill biblical prophecy. To understand Iran's biblical roots, we must go back to the book of Genesis, where the origins of all nations are traced through Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. According to Genesis 10, Japheth's descendants spread across various regions, establishing some of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. One of Japheth's sons was Madai, whose lineage became the foundation of the Medes, one of the two great peoples that would later form the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes initially settled in what is now northwestern Iran, and over time they became a dominant power in the ancient Near East. And Anointed One, emphasizing his role in restoring Israel, Isaiah 44:28-45. One text, Versia. This level of divine foresight highlights how integral Persia was to biblical history. Persia's influence, however, was not limited to a single moment in time. Throughout the Old Testament, Persian rulers and officials played key roles in shaping the fate of God's people. The Medes and Persians were not merely bystanders in biblical history, they were active participants in God's unfolding plan. They ruled over vast territories that included Israel, Babylon, and much of the ancient world, governing with policies that allowed the Jewish people to survive, rebuild, and ultimately prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah. Even beyond the historical and political aspects, Persia's spiritual significance in the Bible is remarkable. The inclusion of Madai as an ancestor of the Medes in Genesis 10 directly links the Iranian people to the biblical genealogy of nations. This means that from the very beginning of recorded history, Iran's presence in the biblical narrative was established. The Medes and Persians were not just powerful empires that happened to intersect with Israel's story, they were divinely positioned to play a role in the fulfillment of prophecy. When we look at Persia's biblical origins, we see that Iran's role in history was no accident. The rise of the Medo-Persian Empire was foretold in prophetic visions, such as those in the book of Daniel, where it is symbolized as a great beast in a silver kingdom, Daniel 2:7-8. Persia's prominence in biblical history shows that God's sovereignty extends beyond Israel and includes the nations of the world, using them as instruments for his divine plan. Understanding Iran's biblical roots allows us to see history through a different lens. Rather than viewing Persia as just another empire of the past, we recognize it as a nation that was specifically named and used by God for his purposes. From the post-flood generations to the rise of Cyrus the Great, Persia's story is woven into the fabric of biblical prophecy, proving that God can use any nation, even one outside his covenant, to fulfill his promises. Throughout the Bible, Persia is not just mentioned as a great empire of the ancient world. It is a nation that played a direct and powerful role in fulfilling God's plans for Israel. While other empires such as Egypt and Babylon were known for oppressing God's people, Persia was unique in that it became an instrument of restoration and deliverance. The Persian rulers, though not part of Israel's covenant with God, were used to bring about some of the most critical events in biblical history. From the fall of Babylon to the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and even the miraculous survival of the Jewish people under Persian rule, the influence of Persia in the biblical narrative cannot be overstated. The most significant moment in Persia's biblical history begins with the fall of the Babylonian Empire. In 586 BC, Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar, had destroyed Jerusalem, demolished the temple, and taken the people of Judah into exile. This period of captivity had been prophesied by Jeremiah, who foretold that the Jewish people would remain in Babylon for 70 years before being allowed to return. Jeremiah 25:11-12, 29:10. At the time, Babylon was the dominant power in the region, and it seemed impossible that the exiles would ever be freed. But then, something extraordinary happened. Persia rose to power, and everything changed. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, conquered Babylon. Unlike other rulers who sought to dominate and oppress, Cyrus had a different approach. He is remembered in history as a king who promoted religious tolerance and allowed the various peoples of his empire to worship freely. This characteristic of his rule became a fulfillment of biblical prophecy in an incredible way. The book of Ezra opens with a decree from Cyrus himself, allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, Ezra 1:1 and 4. In his proclamation, Cyrus acknowledges that the God of heaven had given him all the kingdoms of the earth and had appointed him to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This statement is astonishing because it shows that God had moved the heart of a foreign, pagan king to accomplish his will for his chosen people. What makes this event even more remarkable is that Cyrus was mentioned by name over 150 years before his birth by the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah 44:28, and 45:1, God refers to Cyrus as his shepherd and his anointed, declaring that he would be the one to rebuild Jerusalem and set the exiles free. This is one of the most striking prophecies in the Bible, demonstrating God's sovereignty over nations and rulers long before they come into power. Under Cyrus's leadership, thousands of Jews returned to Jerusalem, marking the beginning of their restoration as a nation. They began rebuilding the Second Temple, an event that was central to the religious and cultural revival of Israel. Cyrus's role in this process highlights the way God can use even those outside of his covenant to accomplish his divine purposes. However, Persia's influence in biblical history did not end with Cyrus. Later, during the reign of King Xerxes I, Ahasuerus in the Bible, another crucial event unfolded: the story of Queen Esther. Esther, a Jewish woman, became queen of Persia at a time when a powerful official named Haman plotted to exterminate all the Jews in the empire. Haman manipulated the king into issuing a royal decree that would allow for the destruction of the Jewish people. But through God's providence, Esther, encouraged by her cousin Mordecai, courageously approached the king and revealed her Jewish identity, pleading for her people's survival. In Esther 4:14, Mordecai tells her, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" This moment was a turning point. Not only was Haman's evil plan thwarted, but the king issued a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves. What could have been a tragic annihilation of the Jewish people turned into a miraculous deliverance, celebrated to this day during the Jewish festival of Purim. This account is yet another example of how Persia, though not part of Israel's covenant, was used by God to protect and sustain his people. Instead of being an enemy like Babylon or Assyria, Persia became a shield for the Jewish people during a time of great danger. Persia's role in biblical history shows us that no nation, no ruler, and no empire is beyond God's control. He can raise up kings and bring them down, using them for his greater plan, even when they do not acknowledge him, whether through Cyrus the Great, who freed the Jewish exiles, or Esther, who saved her people from destruction. Persia was a tool in God's hands, fulfilling his divine purposes in ways that still impact the world today. Persia's role in the Bible is not just confined to historical events. It is also deeply woven into biblical prophecy. From the visions of the prophet Daniel to the apocalyptic writings of Ezekiel, Persia was not just another empire that rose and fell. It was a kingdom specifically mentioned in God's divine plan for the future. Its presence in prophecy reveals how God's sovereignty extends beyond Israel, orchestrating the rise and fall of empires to fulfill his ultimate purposes. Persia was not only a tool in restoring Israel, but also a key player in the unfolding story of the end times. One of the most striking examples of Persia in biblical prophecy is found in the book of Daniel. Daniel, a Jewish prophet who lived during the Babylonian exile, served in the royal courts of both the Babylonian and Persian empires. He was given several visions that revealed the succession of world powers and their influence over God's people. In Daniel 2, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had a dream of a giant statue composed of different metals, each representing a major kingdom that would rise and fall. The chest and arms of silver in the statue symbolized the Medo-Persian Empire, which would replace Babylon as the dominant power in the region. This prophecy was fulfilled when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, marking the transition from Babylonian rule to Persian rule over Israel. Another vision in Daniel 7 describes four great beasts, representing four successive empires. The second beast, a bear raised up on one side, represents the Medo-Persian Empire, symbolizing the unequal partnership between the Medes and the Persians, with Persia being the dominant force. This depiction aligns with historical reality. Although the Medes were initially a powerful group, the Persians ultimately overshadowed them, leading to the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes. Perhaps the most detailed prophecy about Persia is found in Daniel 8, where Daniel sees a vision of a ram with two horns charging in all directions and conquering vast territories. The ram is explicitly identified as the kings of Media and Persia, Daniel 8:20. However, the vision also includes a goat with a single large horn, representing Greece and its king, Alexander the Great. The goat swiftly defeats the ram, symbolizing Greece's conquest of Persia under Alexander's leadership in the 4th century BC. This prophecy, given centuries before these events occurred, once again highlights how Persia's rise and fall were not random events in history, but were foreseen and planned by God beyond. Daniel's visions, Persia is also mentioned in Ezekiel's prophecy of the end times. In Ezekiel 38:39, the prophet describes a coalition of nations that will rise up against Israel in the final days, led by Gog of Magog. Among these nations is Persia, which will join forces with other powers to attack Israel. This prophecy, widely debated among biblical scholars, suggests that Persia, modern-day Iran, will play a significant role in future global conflicts involving Israel. The details of this prophetic war remain uncertain, but the mention of Persia in the context of end times battles indicates that Iran's role in biblical prophecy is far from over. Many theologians and historians speculate that Iran's modern political tensions with Israel could be a precursor to the fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision. The ongoing hostility between Iran and Israel, as well as Iran's alliances with other Middle Eastern nations, aligns with the biblical description of Persia's involvement in future events. Persia's prophetic significance does not just highlight its role in ancient history, but also points toward its potential role in the future. The rise and fall of empires, as described in Daniel, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, reveal that no nation operates outside of God's control. Persia's past was instrumental in the restoration of Israel, and its future may still be connected to the unfolding of end-time events. Ultimately, Persia's presence in biblical prophecy serves as a powerful reminder that history is not random. It is part of a divine narrative. Empires rise and fall, leaders come and go, but God's plan remains sovereign. Whether through the rise of Cyrus, the conquests of the Medo-Persian Empire, or its role in future events, Persia stands as an example of how God uses nations, both those who follow him and those who do not, to fulfill his purposes for the world. While Persia played a major role in ancient biblical history, its significance is not limited to the past. The Bible suggests that Persia, modern-day Iran, will also have a crucial role in future prophetic events. From the prophecies of Ezekiel to the visions in Daniel, Iran's presence in biblical end-time scenarios is undeniable. As tensions in the Middle East continue to rise, many theologians and scholars believe that Iran's actions today may be fulfilling ancient prophecies written thousands of years ago. One of the most well-known end-time prophecies involving Persia is found in Ezekiel 38:39, where the prophet describes a great war in the last days, a massive invasion of Israel led by Gog of Magog. This coalition of nations will come against Israel in what many believe to be a major prophetic war before the return of the Messiah. Among the key nations mentioned is Persia, which aligns with modern-day Iran. The prophecy describes how Persia will join forces with Gog, believed by some scholars to represent Russia, along with other nations such as Kush, Sudan or Ethiopia, Put, Libya, and Togarma, Turkey or parts of Central Asia. This coalition will march against Israel with overwhelming force, expecting an easy victory. However, according to Ezekiel 39, God himself will intervene, supernaturally defeating the invaders and proving his sovereignty to the nations of the world. The inclusion of Persia in this prophecy is significant. Unlike some ancient empires that have faded into history, Persia, Iran, remains a powerful and influential nation today, particularly in its hostile stance toward Israel. In recent decades, Iran has been vocal about its opposition to Israel, with its leaders repeatedly calling for the destruction of the Jewish state. Iran also maintains alliances with Russia and other Middle Eastern powers, which closely mirrors the alliances described in Ezekiel's prophecy. Some scholars argue that Ezekiel 38-39 could be describing a future military conflict involving Iran, Russia, and their allies against Israel, possibly leading to a global crisis. While interpretations of this prophecy vary, it is undeniable that Iran's modern geopolitical position closely aligns with the biblical description of Persia's role in the last days. Beyond Ezekiel's prophecy, Daniel's visions also provide insight into the rise and fall of empires, including Persia, leading up to the end times. In Daniel 2 and 7, the prophet outlines a succession of world kingdoms that will ultimately be replaced by God's eternal kingdom. While Persia's dominance ended with Alexander the Great's conquest, the prophetic implications of Persia's legacy continue. The Persian Empire set the stage for the spread of Judaism and later Christianity, influencing the world in ways that would prepare for the coming of the Messiah. Additionally, the book of Revelation, the final book of the Bible, hints at a great end-time struggle centered around Israel and the surrounding nations. While Persia, Iran, is not directly named in Revelation, many biblical scholars believe that the nations involved in the final conflict will include Iran, given its historical and prophetic significance. Revelation describes a great battle between the forces of good and evil, with nations rising against God's people before the ultimate victory of Christ. The ongoing political and military tensions between Iran and Israel could be viewed as precursors to these prophetic events. Iran's growing influence in the Middle East, its alliances with world powers like Russia and China, and its nuclear ambitions all contribute to the idea that it may play a significant role in future conflicts. Whether or not these events unfold exactly as some interpretations suggest, the connection between Iran and biblical prophecy remains strong. The Bible's message about Persia is clear. God is in control of history, and no nation, no matter how powerful, is beyond his sovereignty. Just as Cyrus the Great was used by God to restore Israel, modern-day Iran may still be a key player in his divine plan, whether as an ally or an adversary of his people. For those who follow biblical prophecy, the unfolding events in the Middle East serve as a reminder that God's word remains relevant today. The same Persia that helped rebuild Jerusalem thousands of years ago now stands as one of Israel's greatest adversaries, setting the stage for what could be the fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision. Ultimately, the role of Iran in biblical prophecy underscores a larger truth. God's plan is unfolding before our eyes, and history is moving toward a divine conclusion. Whether through ancient empires or modern nations, the Bible shows that every kingdom, every leader, and every event is under God's sovereign control. The story of Persia, modern-day Iran in the Bible, is one of the most remarkable examples of how God uses nations to fulfill his divine purposes. From its earliest mention as the descendants of Madai, a son of Japheth, to its pivotal role in restoring Israel, Persia was not just another empire in history. It was a key player in God's redemptive plan, chosen to influence the fate of his people in ways that continue to have significance today. The biblical account of Persia offers profound lessons about God's sovereignty over history, his ability to use even non-believing nations to accomplish his will, and the unfolding of prophecy that extends into our modern world. One of the most striking aspects of Persia's biblical story is its role in bringing about Israel's restoration. Unlike Babylon and Assyria, which conquered and oppressed Israel, Persia, under Cyrus the Great, was the instrument of Israel's return. The decree of Cyrus, which allowed the Jewish exiles to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, was an unprecedented act of political and religious tolerance, demonstrating how even a pagan king could be used by God. This historical moment was not just about a king's decree, it was a fulfillment of prophecy given over 100 years earlier by Isaiah, proving that God is in control of world events long before they happen. Beyond restoration, Persia's role in protecting the Jewish people is another testament to God's providence. The story of Queen Esther highlights how God positions individuals in power for such a time as this, Esther 4:14. When Haman plotted to destroy the Jews, it was Esther, a Jewish woman who had become queen of Persia, who bravely stepped forward and changed the course of history. The book of Esther is a reminder that God places people in positions of influence for divine reasons, even when they do not fully understand his plan at the time. But Persia's story does not end with the Old Testament. Persia's influence extended into the New Testament, with many scholars believing that the Magi who traveled to worship the newborn Jesus were from the region of Persia. The wisdom of the Magi who followed the star to Bethlehem symbolizes the spiritual connection between Persia and biblical prophecy, even after the fall of the Persian Empire. This suggests that Persia's legacy was not just political, but also spiritual, playing a role in the recognition of Christ's arrival. Looking beyond ancient history, Persia's role in biblical prophecy about the end times suggests that Iran may still be a key player in future world events. The prophecy in Ezekiel 38:9, which describes Persia, Iran, as part of a coalition that will rise against Israel in the last days, serves as a warning that history is still unfolding according to God's plan. Today, we see tensions between Iran and Israel, the rise of alliances between Iran and other nations, and the geopolitical importance of the Middle East, all of which seem to align with biblical predictions. While the exact timeline and nature of these events remain uncertain, the inclusion of Persia in end-time prophecy shows that God's word remains relevant in today's world. Lessons from Persia's biblical story for today. What can we learn from Persia's role in the Bible? The greatest lesson is that God is sovereign over all nations. He raises up kingdoms and he brings them down. He can use believers and non-believers, kings and commoners, empires and individuals to fulfill his plan. The story of Persia teaches us that even secular leaders and powerful nations are not beyond God's control. Another important lesson is that history is not random. God is writing a larger story. We often view world events as chaotic, but the Bible shows that even the rise and fall of empires were carefully orchestrated within God's divine timeline. This means that as we look at the world today with rising conflicts, shifting alliances, and global uncertainty, we can trust that God's plan is still unfolding. Persia's story also reminds us that faithfulness in the face of uncertainty leads to blessing and protection. The Jewish people under Persian rule, whether in exile, facing genocide, or rebuilding their nation, had to trust in God's faithfulness. Just as Cyrus was prophesied to be Israel's deliverer, just as Esther had to act with courage, just as Daniel remained faithful in a foreign land, we too are called to trust that God is working even in times of uncertainty. Bringing it to today, a modern perspective today, Iran is once again at the center of global attention. Its political influence, military power, and relationship with Israel continue to shape Middle Eastern affairs. While the modern nation of Iran is not the same as ancient Persia in every way, its biblical connections remain undeniable. The prophecies concerning Persia remind us that history moves according to God's timeline, and what was foretold thousands of years ago may still have implications for the future. But beyond political events, the most important takeaway from Persia's story is this: God is in control, and he uses all things for his purpose. Whether it was through a pagan king like Cyrus, a faithful queen like Esther, or a prophetic vision of Persia's future, the message remains the same. God is actively guiding history toward his ultimate plan for redemption. As we watch modern events unfold, we should not live in fear, but in faith. Just as God used Persia to restore Israel and protect his people, he continues to work through nations and leaders. We may not always see the full picture, but we can trust that God's hand is moving behind the scenes. The story of Persia, both past and future, is a powerful reminder that God's promises never fail. His sovereignty is absolute, and history is ultimately leading toward his final victory.